Welcome back, everyone. Thank you for those of you who joined us a little earlier for Uma's session, which was so beautiful. You know, there are some teachers who just being in their presence, like literally just being around them, you instantly feel your nervous system kind of settle and your heart open. Like there's just this instant change in the bhav, in the feeling. And I know I personally have the deepest experience of that with Uma. And I know that many of you do too. It's almost like it doesn't matter what she says or does, it's just going to be magic. So yeah, very, very beautiful to spend that time with her. And thank you for being around for that. This next part of our live offering this morning is a little different. I wanted to share with you really just some reflections around the idea of spiritual activism and around the purpose of this project, what would love do, and some of my reflections and thoughts about what's going on in the world at the moment. And I'll start with the very clear caveat that I have absolutely no expectation that everyone agrees with me. I am very open to differences of opinion. I'm very open to you having a different perspective. In fact, I celebrate that, and I'll be talking about that as we go on. So please join with an open heart and an open mind, and the full knowledge that this is not a lecture or a sort of presentation of me telling you what to think. It's rather just my own personal reflections and an invitation to share yours. Of course, for those of you listening to the replay, we'd love to hear. You can post in the comments below if you have any feedback or thoughts or things that you'd like to share with others. That's also an option. And for live interaction, I'll definitely be allowing some time for questions and answers. And then we'll wrap up our time together this morning at 11:30. So after this session, we'll take a short break. And at 11:30, we'll be joined by Jane Hardwick-Collins, who's another great elder and vision seeker and space holder in our communities. And she'll be leading some ceremony and some prayers for peace. So, I wanted to start by saying, and I'm very comfortable with owning this, that I am someone who really does not have a lot of knowledge about the politics of the Middle East, and I don't have a deep understanding of all the nuance of the complexity, and I know it's an enormously complex and historical situation. In fact, somebody messaged me recently and said, well, let me first back up a little bit and say, in the main part, I receive extremely positive and supportive messaging and emails and communication from my community about my reflections and positioning on what's happening in Gaza at the moment. However, there are a few, and they're really just like a small handful of people who have been critical or who have had differences of opinions and have voiced those, which, like I said before, I welcome completely and deeply. But one person did message me and say, a little bit sarcastically, oh, I'm sure you think you're a complete expert about this and you've got it all nicely wrapped up with a bow, but let me tell you, it's very complex. And actually my response to that, which was a loving response, was I really don't, because I'm not politically minded in the sense of like spending a lot of time understanding the ins and outs. I don't even watch the news very often, so I'm quite dependent on what I see on social media or the things I seek out, which is active kind of understanding or knowledge gathering. And the reason I'm sharing this with you is because I genuinely don't believe that you have to be deeply knowledgeable about a subject to have an opinion on it, if that opinion is one of peace seeking, right? If I were to have political ideas and suggestions around what, ceasefire could look like or how the politics could unfold, that's different. Then you need a lot of education, a lot of subtle understanding. But to simply have a heartfelt desire for suffering to be reduced and for peace to prevail, that doesn't require education. It doesn't require lots of understanding. And it's very, very similar with the situation with our Indigenous brothers and sisters here in Australia. Many of you know that we just recently had a vote around Indigenous representation in Parliament, and very disappointingly, from my perspective, the vote turned out to be a no vote. So the people of Australia were not supporting the representation that was being offered. I found that to be extremely disappointing. And again, I don't have a lot of understanding of the nuanced complexity around Indigenous culture here in Australia and the history and the politics. I have somewhat of an understanding, more than I do about Gaza, I can say that, but certainly not the level of understanding that would be needed to have opinions around policy and politics. But what I do know is that there is an opportunity for us to live in peace, for us to live in harmony, for us to learn from each other, for us to say sorry for the atrocities of the past and to do better as we move into the future. And these are very simple umbrella statements, but it doesn't mean they're not potent, and it doesn't mean they're not important. And what I see happening a lot in our spiritual communities, like heartbreakingly so, Uma has reflected this back to me many times. I know Rachel, who also worked on this project with me, feels very strongly about this too, is that people in fear of saying or doing the wrong thing or offending somebody do nothing. They do nothing. And this is the toxicity of our time. It isn't haters. It isn't people who have an active position of dividing or creating animosity. It's actually the millions and billions of people that just do nothing because they don't know what to do. Martin Luther King was the most famous person to speak about this, I think. He spoke about how during the civil rights movement in America, the problem was not people were racist. He said most people aren't racist. The biggest problem that we're facing, he spoke about during this time, is the everyday person who chooses to turn a blind eye because they don't want to get involved or they don't know what to say or do. You know, the person that accepts that white people sit at the front of the bus and black people sit at the back and just allows that to be so. And this is how the Holocaust took place as well, that the mass of people in Germany at the time just kept their heads down, kept their business to themselves because they didn't want to become involved. And I believe truly deeply in my bones, in every cell of my being, that as spiritual practitioners, no matter what your spirituality, no matter what your faith, as human beings that have a connection to God and a desire for peace, we have a sacred duty, a dharma, a responsibility to speak up when we see suffering. And it is literally that simple. The suffering could be in Israel, the suffering could be in Palestine, the suffering could be in Sudan, it could be anywhere in the world. But when we see suffering, it is our sacred duty, if we are in a position of privilege where we have the capacity, like Uma said, of connectivity, of communication, to stand up and say something. And if we have the means to do something proactively as well. One of the reasons why I chose Doctors Without Borders as the charity for this particular offering, and for those of you who weren't on earlier, I'll just let you know that we've raised $6,352, which is just so heartwarming, from a donation of 116 different people. I chose Doctors Without Borders because they're non-denominational. They're not a religious organization. They're not an organization that takes sides. In fact, Without Borders kind of says it all. They literally work to alleviate suffering. A close friend of mine worked in Afghanistan during the wars there, you know, around the times of after 9/11. And he's a doctor, and he spoke to me many, many times over many years about the powerful work that Doctors Without Borders do, and about his own on-the-ground experience of how their advocacy is really entrenched in non-judgment and non-bias, and also how they don't take a lot of money through administration. Like, most of the dollar that you give goes directly on the ground to support and relief, medical supplies, food, etc., etc. And so I know from that experience, but also from my own research, that it's a charity that really directs money where it needs to go in a way that is aligned with the values of non-judgment and peacekeeping and reducing suffering. I wanted to share with you a short reading, and I hope that you'll sort of feel how this segues into being connected to what I've just spoken about. This reading comes from a woman called Kelly Deals, and she calls herself a culture maker, and she's a feminist, an activist, a writer, a business owner. She is someone who's been important in my own business and the sort of ethics behind my business. She's very much an ethical critic, I guess you could say. And here's what she says. She says, "I'm a cultural omnivore. I read across genres and ideologies. I'm interested in different ends of the political spectrum, and I could mention people with opposing views in the same essay and find something valuable that we can fashion into a change-making tool, even if I despair of their worldview or wider body of work. I realize this is not normal, but here's the thing. Normal has never served culture makers and truth tellers and paradigm shifters. Normal has never served women or anyone marked as other in our culture. So let's dispense with normal and claim our culture making power to change everything every day. I love this sentiment because what she's pointing to is that we have the capacity within us always to point the finger and say, I don't agree with this person. I don't agree with that person. And then throw the baby out with the bathwater and say, okay, polarizing, they're not for me. I'm not going to support them. I don't, they're not aligned. And in fact, when we were creating What Would Love Do, we had some dialogue and some conversation around who the presenters would be and what this project would represent. And it was easy to get sort of drawn into the rabbit hole of looking at individual presenters and individual contributors and even those who donate and asking, do we have an aligned mission? Do we have aligned values? Do we have an aligned perspective? And the answer is truly no, we don't, because at that point when that rabbit hole presented itself, it would have been so easy to get into nitpicking and analysis and division, creating boundaries, creating borders. And I decided, in alignment with the teachings that I've received from community leaders like Kelly, like Uma, like my dear teacher, Sharon Ganon, who I'll mention in a moment, I decided to not make that analysis. If somebody wanted to show up and help us raise funds as a presenter or a donator or a collaborator, then the door is open. Even if those people have perspectives that are very different to mine and we're not 100% aligned in every way, we'll look for, where do we have some point of commonality? Where do we have some point of connection? And this shows up in our daily lives in so many ways. Like this isn't just in a larger political arena, it's also at play in our lives, in very micro ways. A very small example from my own life is, many of you know, I co-parent. So I have 4 sons with my ex-husband and we co-parent, and we don't agree on many, many things. I mean, if we agreed on more things, possibly we wouldn't be divorced. And yet we have a common ground of wanting the best for our children. And so even if every other area that I'm trying to negotiate or navigate with my ex-husband is difficult and challenging and wrought with division, we can agree that we want the best for our children. That is one seed within the ocean of everything else of agreement. And that is what I hold on to. And that is what I remember. And that is what I really use as the anchor point in my conversations and interactions with him. And this works on that micro level, but also on the macro of looking at literally the conversation around world peace. Some of you will have seen I've been writing and blogging a little bit about a beautiful well, he's a very interesting man, actually. His name's Bassam Yassar, and I'm sure some of you have heard of him. So he is, I would say, an activist, definitely. He's Egyptian by birth. He became a surgeon and practiced for many years in Egypt as a surgeon. And then he became a comedian, which is really incongruous and kind of, a strange turn of events. But he's very good at it. I find him very entertaining. And he became a comedian in Egypt and had a very popular show on television. He hosted a show. And then he sort of burst into world fame and became well known in America and the UK and here in Australia. In fact, last year he did a tour in Australia, and he's very political, very outspoken. He's a peacekeeper, he's a peacemaker, he's an activist for peace, and really reinforced my thinking around the idea that we don't need to be completely politically educated to have a position of strong advocacy for peace and the reducing of suffering. He was recently interviewed by the UK television host and media mogul Piers. The name just left me. Piers Morgan. And Piers Morgan's very well known as kind of being right-wing and quite stuffy and just a very difficult human to navigate if you're coming from a sort of place of any sort of alternative or leftist thinking. And you know, many people criticized Bassam for being interviewed by peers, but actually he took it on as a challenge of speaking to someone who has very different opinions to him. And he did there's a beautiful, and I'll share this in the notes below the video, so if you're watching live or you're watching the replay, I'll make sure you've got access to this. But there's a beautiful podcast that he gave before he did the interview, where he talks about the process and the journey that he went through to speak about. And he, you know, he's advocating for peace, of course, in Gaza, and he's very much active advocating for ceasefire. To speak with Piers Morgan around, you know, knowing they were going to disagree, going into a very public, very well exposed conversation that millions of people were going to watch, knowing that there would be profound disagreement in their politics, in their ideologies, in their opinions, and how Bassam prepared for this. And he did so much deep work around showing up in integrity, showing up in his fullest centering of who he is and what he believes, not losing himself, but also being able to have a conversation respectfully and amicably with someone with whom he has fundamentally different position and opinion, someone who he would probably even argue supports evil or supports you know, the creation and the causing of suffering. So there's so much for us to learn in this, and you can watch the interviews again. I'll link them below. It's fascinating to watch. My teacher, Sharon Ganon, who is the founder of Jivamukti Yoga, which is the method that I've trained in, she wrote an essay back in the early 2000s, a little while ago, and it's about this idea of having conversations with people that we are struggling with people that we disagree with, you know, in areas that we don't feel confident. And essentially there's three main points that she made, and I want to share these with you today. And the reason I'm sharing them again, just to loop back, is to really hold space for those of you who feel the desire for advocacy or activism, but hold back because you feel like, I don't know enough and who am I to step up, is to encourage you. You know, I remember years ago, just as a quick tangent, years ago, I got approached by Yoga Australia, the governing body for yoga here in Australia. And they asked me if I would run a program, a forum around inclusivity and Indigenous Australians and yoga. And I was absolutely astounded as to why they had asked me, a white woman from British background, who didn't even grow up in Australia. And before I said no, because I knew that I wasn't the person for that role, I asked them, why have you asked me? Like, I'm the least likely candidate for this position. And the reply that came through was, you were the only yoga teacher that we could find who's a member of Yoga Australia, which has thousands of members, many thousands of members, who had blogged or written or spoken about, this is going back quite some time, Indigenous Australians and yoga, and the connection between colonialism and the yamas and the niyamas, or the ethics of yoga, and the opportunity for healing that exists. And honestly, it was so disappointing to me that my contribution, my microscopic, like 2 blog post reflections and an article in a magazine contribution, was the best that we had available. Like, I was the advocate. And it shocked me and it upset me. And what we did on the back of that, of course, I continued to work with Yoga Australia on that project, but not as a face of the project, but behind the scenes, is we found Indigenous teachers and we found people who genuinely did have a lot more knowledge and education than me. And we created a whole arm, a whole branch of Yoga Australia, which beautifully, and continues to do so today, honours and acknowledges Indigenous Australians. If I hadn't written those 2 blog posts and that magazine article, who would they have reached out to, and would the project have ever come off the ground? So I wasn't the person to do most of the work in that area, because I'm not qualified. But I was able to sow a few seeds, to start a few conversations, and to create the beginning of a ripple effect, and then to draw in people who are qualified to have opinions and ideas and support this work. So whenever you have this desire to make a difference, to say something, to speak up against suffering, to advocate, to raise money, to be an activist, my strongest intention, my heartfelt desire is that you step up into that. Even if you feel like I might embarrass myself, I don't know, it'll make me unpopular, all of those doubts creep in. We have to be, as Gandhi so famously said, the change that we wish to see in the world. And if not us, then who? And if not now, then when? Like, how will it happen? How will change happen if we don't keep advocating? So these are the three things that Sharon shared that she felt, and then I'll open up for questions and comments, that she felt were really important in having conversations with those with whom we disagree, or having conversations around activism and advocacy when we have some self-doubt and we're unsure about whether or not we should be putting ourselves forward. The first one is, she says, we have to see all others as holy beings. So this is the foundation of yoga teaching. Yoga, the word yoga literally means to connect, to bind yourself to the divine, to source, to God, to a higher being. And you could even see that as your higher self, or you could see that as Mother Earth. The terminology isn't important, but the essence of what yoga teaching is all about is to create connection between yourself and something bigger than yourself, what my teacher Sharon would call a skin encapsulated ego. So something beyond the micro you. And when we create that connection, what we know to be true is that all of us, every single human being on the planet throughout time and space, has that same capacity to connect to the holy, the divine, to God, to source. Now that capacity could be severely severed. You know, that relationship could be very, very dysfunctional and disrupted and not felt, right? But the potential is there. So it is our job as spiritual teachers, guides, practitioners to feel into the possibility that every being has the potential to be enlightened, holy, a great teacher, a master. You know, the beautiful story of Milarepa, one of the best friends of the Buddha, is an illustration of this. The Buddha befriended a man in his lifetime who was a murderer, had killed many people, and you know, an evil man. And lots of scholars and academics and, you know, historians have looked at this story and kind of with confusion, saying, how could the Buddha, this great saint, this being of light, be such good friends, such close acquaintance with a murderer? And it's because of this teaching that we see, we forgive. Jesus was the same. It was his message too. We see the capacity for goodness. And when we see that in another being, we pull it out of them. We actually, in our seeing it, we help them to see it. And this might take generations. It might not happen in a day or a week or over years, but it eventually, inevitably, when we choose to see the goodness in others, that goodness will start to come forth. This is the promise of the yogic teaching. So we have to see all beings as holy. Second, we have to model compassion and healing. Sharon says love and acceptance are the most powerful political acts. So if we're in division and judgment and polarizing and creating borders and boundaries around who we are and who we perceive others to be, then we're not actually modeling compassion and healing. We're creating further divide. We're creating further division. When we step into curiosity, a willingness to listen, and this goes back to what I was talking about with Kelly Deals earlier, when we step into this place of, okay, you have a completely different perspective about this to me, and I'm curious. I want to understand. I want to get inside your head and understand why you believe what you believe and why you're coming from the position that you're coming from. Then we start to open up the possibility of conversation. And conversation leads to ceasefire. You know, it leads to ceasefire of every kind, between two humans, between two nations, between two opposing political ideologies. It actually creates the possibility that we find common ground, even in just the tiniest of areas. So this opening up of compassion, this opening up of accepting other people's perspectives and getting curious about them. And one of the ways we can do that is to actually, and I believe this is a very powerful political act, expose ourselves to media from people with whom we don't agree. So, you know, it goes back to the Kelly Deals quote where she says, I can find something from everyone that is a gem. You know, I might feel like 99.9% of it needs to go in the trash, but I'll find one point of connection. During the pandemic, when the pandemic first broke out and COVID was just in the news and everywhere, of course, my algorithm, because I'm, you know, an individual human being, was feeding me particular narratives around what was happening with the pandemic. And I became really curious about what some of the other narratives were. And I started listening to, you know, because we all had plenty of time on our hands to listen to stuff back then in lockdown. I started listening to lots of podcasts, radio shows, reading blog posts from people who had completely different perspectives to me, like radically different. And actually, I mean, just to be fully transparent, my perspective on COVID is somewhat middle ground. I'm not conspiracy theorist, and I'm also not, you know, I think there's a lot of stuff that happened around COVID that was not well exposed in the most genuine way. So I sit somewhere in the middle. But regardless of what my personal opinions and politics are, I really sort out the differences of opinions from the very, very far left to the very, very far right and all the way looping back in between. And, you know, sometimes I'd be listening to a podcast and shouting at it while I'm doing the washing up because I don't agree. And I'm like very impassioned about that. But the point is that I listened and I was open to hearing other perspectives, even if I'm, you know, absolutely the opposite in my thinking. And in doing so, conversation starts, resolution begins, because we start to understand, even if we don't agree, why someone has a different perspective to us. So this was Sharon's second point. Conversation is essential to resolution, to ceasefire. Sorry, that was her third point. The second one being love and acceptance are the most powerful political acts. So let me just summarize those for you again. Number one, we have to see all as holy beings, modeling compassion and healing. Number two, love and acceptance are the most powerful political acts. And number three, conversation is essential to resolution and to ceasefire. So these are some of my thoughts, some of my kind of ramblings, and I will also caveat everything I've said so far today with the statement that I don't have a fully formed, clear, cohesive, perfect pathway mapped out in my mind around all of these different thoughts and ideas. It's still very much a work in progress for me, but I'm not going to wait until I feel like I have the perfect lecture, the perfect blog post, the perfect summary of these ideologies to share with you before I share, because if I wait for that, it may never happen. I'm happy to show up and share with you in a way that is still a work in progress, that is still a little bit messy, that I'm still very much piecing together myself, and to open up this conversation and be willing and available to have it in the spirit of activism, and most importantly in the spirit of a desperate prayer and desire that the genocide stops and that the suffering stops, and that we do better as a species, like as the human species, that we just do better, because it's so deeply disappointing to me that we're not doing better right now. So I'll pause there. I do want to end with a short prayer and a little just moment of coming together and sharing that heartfelt desire for peace. But I would love to hear your comments or questions or thoughts. If anyone has anything that brought up for you that you'd like to share or ask, I would really love to hear that now. Feel free to unmute yourself.
I'll jump in, Katie.
Thanks, Rach.
So I'm kind of coming from like reflecting on what you're saying in terms of spiritual activism, and seeing, I totally agree with you. And at the same time, I'm like, well, how do we actually call out people who, in my view, are doing really terrible things? Like, yesterday I was like, oh, I was fully on fire with the news that Australia's withdrawn aid to Gaza. And I was just like, you know, a week ago they had said that they were going to be increasing aid. And it's like, oh, I'm so mad, and I need to direct this at the people who can do something about it. And from what you're saying is that we need to come from a place of being more curious. But I'm like, oh, isn't there a place for that sort of rage too?
Yeah.
Although
Yeah.
it may not be received in a way that going to be responded to, because of the way that I'm coming at it.
Yes. I love this question. Thank you so much, and for expressing it with such a personal lens as well. And I feel the same. I have exactly, like I said, I'm often shouting at the radio, but here's the thing, and this is coming from, I'm channeling my own teachers now. Like, this isn't my own wisdom and insight. This is what I have learned through lived experience with my own teachers, who are the most incredible examples of this. Uma being one of them. Uma is the most beautiful example of exactly what we're talking about now. And she's incredibly politically active. If you look at her Instagram, she's like on it every single day. But you couldn't meet a more loving, compassionate, and open-hearted person. First of all, it takes a lot of spiritual maturity to hold both. And I'm not saying this because I've achieved it, because I'm still at the shouting at the radio stage, right? But it does take a lot of wisdom and spiritual development and work on ourselves to be able to hold space for, I'm extremely angry and I disagree and I think this, what's happening is evil, and I'm curious and I want to understand and I want to find connection and I want to find a place of conversation, right? That takes a lot. So that's the first thing to understand. Secondly, the anger piece. So the anger has to come out, right? The anger has to be discharged. And what is really important is that the anger is discharged not in the direction of the perpetrator, the perceived perpetrator, because that never leads to any resolution whatsoever. So we discharge the anger in our own ways, in our own time, through the practices that we have available to us. Scream into a pillow, go to the gym, whatever it is that you need to do that's healthy and wholesome and releasing of that anger, recalibrate the nervous system, yoga nidra, etc., etc. That's a very important piece of activism. And then we come to the conversation, whether it's between you and one other human being or whether it's between two nations, from a place of, this anger is not so alive in me that I can't see that you have a perspective that's valid, right? It doesn't mean that you agree. I'm going to just use a really raw example here because it's potent. Let's look at the Holocaust, okay? If we were in a position where we were actually able to have a conversation with Hitler about his regime that he created around literally wanting to just remove Jewish people from the planet, then of course there would be so much emotion and feeling in that it would be almost impossible. I'm pretty sure I wouldn't be able to have that conversation, right? But however, the likelihood that you would be able to create change in thinking or in perspective is so much greater if you find common ground. Like at least, even if you don't agree, but at least if you understand why the person is feeling and thinking the way that they are, than if you come at it with you're evil, this is wrong. It just never ever creates the possibility for conversation and change. So, and a big part of that too is that we also have to accept that the person is probably going to carry on doing what they're already doing. When we come into the conversation, if we come into the conversation with this has to change, I'm going to be the person that changes it, I'm going to speak my mind, actually all we're doing is serving our own anger and serving ourselves. Now, I'm saying all of that to you as if I've got it all figured out, and I absolutely, humbly, hand on heart, do not. I'm sharing that with you because that's what my teachers have shared with me. And when I hear my teachers share it, Uma amongst them, Sharon Ganon amongst them, Kelly Deals amongst them, I feel in my body and I feel in my heart and in my soul, there's a trueness there. That place of the capacity for forgiveness and the capacity for conversation feels true, and it feels much, much more relevant than just, I'm going to be angry and I'm going to tell them off and I'm going to be outraged and I'm going to fight. And so I hold on to that feeling and I do the best I can to then continue to share it and be a channel and be a guide for that way of thinking without always getting it right, and without even fully understanding how that can possibly work, because the world is full of evil and there is heartbreaking atrocity happening in every moment. It's hard to come from just from the chat box. It's hard to come from a place of peace and acceptance when they're clearly making terrible, horrible decisions that are affecting so many innocents. I could not agree more. And Fran says, thank you, Katie. I completely agree. A Rumi quote comes to mind. Out beyond ideas of wrongdoing and right doing, there's a field. I'll meet you there. And we all have the power to access compassion for everyone's different context and different season. Some are in their season of rage and expression. Others are in the sitting with space, trusting they'll know where and when to put their energy, and many more in the seasons and contexts. There's room for it all. And similarly, I'm sharing this from my context and experience and aim to share what feels true from our shared heart space. Thank you. That's really beautiful. And Fran, my own personal perspective and my own personal add-on to that is, and this is just really my personal opinion, I personally see anger and outrage as more potent than waiting to see where we're going to share and how we're going to share, because the waiting, as I spoke about at the very beginning, honestly, in my opinion, is the most toxic. When we just sit there and kind of say, I don't know what to do, so I'll do nothing. That, to my mind, is honestly, that feels like truly just not okay, because we sit in this position of privilege. So if you feel the rage, okay, let's express the rage. If you feel the distress, if you feel the anger, if you feel like you need to horrify people and post something on social media that's truly shocking because people just aren't looking and you need them to look, then that, at least in that, is action. I don't think it's skillful action, but I think so. The optimum is skillful action, but the taking of action is so needed in this moment, that to wait until we feel ready to share or to just sit because we don't think we know what to say, that to me is truly a disservice to the capacity that we have. And I will say this, I'll add this into, and again, you may or may not agree with me, I do think what we're seeing in Gaza and Palestine is unprecedented. As I said to you, I don't watch the news a lot. I don't follow world events a lot. Wars are happening all the time. Terrible things are happening on the planet all the time. This is different. This is different. Like, we're watching another Holocaust unfold. We're watching something that is unprecedented and just, to me, so deeply shocking that it can happen in our time, when, like, it's like, have we really learned nothing? Are we really still here? And so that's why I'm being so outspoken and so activated around this particular political situation, this war, because it's a genocide, and I can't live on planet Earth as a human being with capacity and watch genocide happening on the other side of the world and do nothing and say nothing. I just can't do that. Anything else anyone would like to add or say? We'd love to hear from you.
Hey, Katie.
Hey, my love, how are you?
It's Saoirse here. Sorry about the bad hair.
Good. We come as we are.
Yes, indeed. Yeah, I love this. I love all these beautiful reflections. What I'm kind of in right now, I've been very active and speaking out about it and trying to educate, and sometimes angry, crazy, rageful woman, and sometimes trying to bring my own solutions and be the revolution. But I still feel icky, selling my stuff. And then even when I'm trying to make my offerings be in line with the times and align to the times, there's a part of me that's like, oh my God, maybe people will think I'm using this as a fucking means to promote my business. But it's just me being in integrity with being able to share what I'm doing and also speak up about what's happening in the world, because they are connected. But it's like, there's some energetic misalignment, and I'm not able to completely get behind the things that I'm putting out and creating in the world, because I'm so fucking, I'm just so immersed in this, and it's hard to separate the two, but then also they need to be kind of merged. Do you know what I mean? I'd love to just hear your thoughts on that as a businesswoman, as someone who's been in the industry, who's a very, very much an advocate. How do you navigate that? Because I'm sure that there's many people feeling the same, that are actually do care and give a fuck, but also have bills to pay and have stuff that they need to do. You know, we can't press
100%.
pause forever.
And actually not many, but a handful of people are like, you know, several people have reached out to me and said, I want to post, I want to speak up, I want to do something, but I'm just too worried it will damage my business and I need to make an income, which is heartbreaking when we're the opposite way to what you're describing, right? Like that they're actually saying nothing because they're worried the damage it will do and they need to keep selling, in inverted commas. First of all, I just want to really, really celebrate you as a beautiful example. And if people watching and, you know, listening don't like follow Saoirse or haven't seen her social media, you are a woman who is doing exactly what I've just talked about for the last 45 minutes, which is showing up in your rawness and your honesty and your messiness and your not sureness, and owning it and being honest about it and saying, I don't know all the answers, but I have a very strong feeling about this and I want to share it, and I don't care if it creates damage to my business, or, you know, it's like you just are showing up and also beautifully connecting it to your own story. Like, you know, the post that you've written about what's going on in Gaza and how that connects to what happened in Ireland in the past have been really moving to me, because that's your ancestral story too. And so that really helps people connect dots, and there's education in that and there's advocacy in that, and it's very beautiful. So I've really seen that. I think you're a very good example of what I've just been talking about, and I want to reflect that back to you and thank you, because it's not easy. It's not an easy path to walk. And for those of you who are wondering what I've been going on about for the last 45 minutes, go and have a look at Saoirse's stuff, and Uma's another great example, because you'll see what it looks like in action. So that aside, like, again, like, I don't know, I don't have the answers, but I'll tell you what I do. And for me, because I've been doing this work for like 25 years, and I grew up with teachers, you know, I was 18 when I first met Sharon and David, my teachers, and they raised me in my spiritual tradition and in my work and in all the work I do. And they are advocates and activists through and through. Everything they do comes back to activism. And they built great business empires with that at the forefront. You know, I was remembering this morning. Back in the day, Achievement to Yoga in New York, when I used to go to New York regularly and practice and train with them, they were vegans and are vegans and are great advocates of animal rights. And this isn't a conversation about veganism, but veganism was very much at the center of their politic, let's say. And we used to, because back then, and this is in New York City and Manhattan, back then you couldn't get soy milk if you wanted to get a coffee. It was only cow's milk. These days it's like almond, oat, you know, whatever. Back then there was no plant milk option. We used to go to 7-Eleven, buy soy milk, take our soy milk to Starbucks. There was a Starbucks underneath Jivamukti, hand over our carton of soy milk and get ourselves a latte and go back up to the yoga studio. And I felt embarrassed doing that. You know, it was like, oh God, it's really like a bit awkward asking for the soy milk. But those types of actions over time are what led to that Starbucks store in Manhattan being one of the first that rolled out soy milk as an option. And now look at where we're at. So it's like the courage for activism was trained in me from very young. So I feel like that what you're describing, where it can feel like there's a conflict, isn't so. Like, I've had a great blessing with my teachers that they've modeled for me. We can be in business and we can sell and do the work that we're doing, and we can advocate, and those two can sit very gracefully together. And here's the thing, is that your work in the world is so needed right now more than ever. So when you're not putting your offerings out and you're not selling the things that you have to share with people, people don't get to experience the healing that you have to offer. So, you know, it's that old famous quote that, you know, who are you to not shine your light so brightly? Like, people need the work that you're doing. And for you particularly, but for everyone who's listening, you know, you have so much strength, and actually, really, truly, you're a leader. You are a leader in the work that you're doing. And if you're not showing up as a leader and putting your work out in the world, people aren't going to get it. But it's and it's not going to help anyone in Gaza either. I can tell you that right now. Like, you not creating your next book or running your next program or offering your coaching to your clients isn't going to help anyone in Gaza. In fact, you showing up and doing that, and because I know you can't keep your mouth shut, mentioning Gaza whilst you're doing it, service. That's a service right here. I mean, I'm so blown away by my community that honestly, Rachel will tell you, half-assed, pulled together at the last moment way, I'm able to raise $6,000. It's been easy. I didn't have energy for it. I was low in energy. We were just about to head off to India. I was like, I can't. And then that thought of, I just can't. And then some of you know, because I wrote about this, I messaged Uma and I was like, I'm thinking of doing something. What do you think? And she's like, love, I'm so deflated. I'm so burnt out. I'm so disappointed by people not acting. Please do something. So then I was like, okay, this is, I'm being called now. And, you know, that $6,000 has fallen out of the sky, really. If I hadn't built a community through the work that I do in the world, I wouldn't have a community with which to fundraise. So keep building your communities, keep doing your work in the world, build your empire, make your money, be incredible, be a leader, employ people, you know, serve, expand, and then utilize all of that for the work that you want to do in the world. There's a brilliant book called We Should All Be Millionaires, written by Rachel Rodgers. Have you read it?
No, and I need to,
Okay,
because
read
it's
that
the
book.
wealth part that's really.
We Should All Be Millionaires by Rachel Rodgers. It's a very simple, it's a brilliant, brilliant book. I love her.
Oh yeah, she's an American woman, isn't she?
Yeah, African American. So the basic premise of that book is we've got a wounding as women around putting our work out into the world and making money as being in conflict with our values and our advocacy and our activism. And it's misthinking, because the more money we can make, the more work we can do, the bigger we can be, the more we can elevate ourselves as leaders, the more we can serve our communities. It's that simple. I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, it is. Thank you so much. I love you. Thank you. And thank you, everybody.
Amazing work. All right, we're going to have to wrap it up. I feel like we could continue this conversation for a lot longer, but I am going to invite you to pop your comments into the, like, there's a little opportunity for comments below where we're going to post this inside the portal, and I'd love to hear the conversation continue there, and I will drop in and add my thoughts and comments too. So please feel free to do that, and let's keep this conversation going. And if you have resources or helpful links that you would like to share, please do share them in those comments, and I will in turn link to all of the things that I've mentioned today. So if you want to dive deeper, you can, and you can do some more reading and some more research. I want to thank you all for the work that you're doing, for being here, for caring, and I just want to encourage you to keep going, and being brave and being willing to make mistakes and being willing to be criticized and being willing to get it a little bit wrong, but coming back to knowing that your heart is really truly in the right place and that you're wanting to do work in the world that is making a positive impact. Let's just end with the yogi's prayer very briefly. So we're going to meet again at 11:30 with Dear Jane for prayers and ceremony around peace. But for now, Loka Samasta, Sukhino Bhavantu. May all beings everywhere be happy and free. May the thoughts, the words, and the actions of my own life contribute in some way to that happiness and to that freedom for all. Namaste. Thank you, everyone. See you at 11:30.